Hi, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name's Sharon Abbott, and I'm the president of the Together branch of the ASU. And I'd just like to welcome everyone to our April EB and wages briefing. So we've got quite a bit to cover today. So before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise all of the elders from wherever you are logging in this afternoon as well. As I mentioned, we do have quite a bit to cover. So what we might do first up is just hand over to our General Secretary, Alex Scott, who is going to go through a range of items on our agenda, just about how we're actually preparing for our bargaining, because this is a really big bargaining year. So I'll hand over to Alex to kick us off.
Thanks, Sharon, and thanks to everybody for attending today. We will try and keep today to half an hour because we find that's about as much time as people can attend these activities. But given the numbers of people involved, we're trying to get through the questions in the chat. If we can't get to your questions today, we'll get back to you in the next couple of days. We'll also be sending out an email for an option of further questions after, as soon as today's Zoom is finished. In terms of today, you now should be seeing my screen in relation to the education bargaining. In terms of that, what we want to cover today is where we've got to in terms of the bargaining process and also where we're going next. So the first key activity is really to talk about where we're not. For a number of years in education and in schools in particular, we had the problem that we were the most significant component of a larger agreement, being the core EB. And what we found was that members in schools were willing to be more active and to campaign more for changing their working lives than a range of other public servants who were covered in the core. What that normally had meant for a number of agreements that while schools members were willing to fight for issues, other parts of the larger agreement were unwilling to fight, and so therefore they end up settling those bargaining processes quicker than we would have wanted in schools. And that meant we weren't able to get the wins we were able to get in other parts of the sector. What we were able to do in the last bargaining round, for a variety of reasons, was able to move the core away from education and away from child safety. And that meant that last time round, schools for the first time and education for the first time were able to bargain as a single unit rather than being part of a larger activity. So in terms of that process, that's also particularly more obvious this year because the core isn't up for renegotiation until next year, where our members in Education Queensland are up for bargaining later this year. So that we are very much a very different situation for other public servants this time around in terms of the core EB, and it's something that hopefully will mean that we can build on the strength that we achieved in the last bargaining process. We achieved a lot, but there was a lot we didn't get to achieve 4 years ago this time around, and we're hopeful that we really will be able to make significant inroads in terms of the issues that are so important to a range of members in schools. So as part of that process, we have been preparing for bargaining. I might get Sharon briefly to talk a little bit about what that process has looked like so far.
So thanks, Alex. So we, as the Together executive, we've been looking at the education bargaining processes and looking at the ways that we can actually, as Alex mentioned, get the biggest bang for our buck. And so some of the things that we've been considering is obviously our wages is a key component of that, and Alex will talk more about that as we go forward, but also how we can actually engage with members to determine what we actually want to achieve in our EB negotiations this year. We're also in a very interesting situation where every worker in education is actually bargaining. So previously we've been, for example, the last time we bargained, we were first, or actually I think the teachers were first, and then we had our bargaining, and then cleaners and teacher aides bargained a little bit later. And this time, pretty much we're all bargaining in the same year. So that's could be beneficial for us. And that's some of the things that we've been considering as we determine what we're going to do. But the best thing that, if I can say, the best thing that you as a member can do is actually get engaged. And Alex will talk a little bit about that in as we go forward. Now I just wanted to introduce Lis Stalker, who is an admin officer at Mount Morgan State High School, who has worked in education for many, many years. And she just wants to actually just talk to us about how we can get motivated and engaged into the process. So I'll hand over to Lis.
Thank you, Sharon. To introduce myself, I'm Lis, and for just over 26 years, I've been an AO2 admin officer at Mount Morgan State High School, and I'm really excited for what members will be able to achieve this year. Already, from all over the state, Department of Education workers have shown that they are ready and willing to speak up and be heard. There has been an amazing response to the bargaining survey from members and soon to be members from every region and every occupational group. This tells us and the department that we mean business. There were 31 schools where 100% of staff completed the survey and 73 schools with the majority of staff. Congratulations to the delegates at those schools for making sure that their school had their say. This week, delegates have held meetings like the one we're holding today to try to get more surveys completed. This will send a huge and very loud message to the department. If one of your colleagues still needs to return their survey, there's still time. Please ask them to send it through today. Also, please encourage your non-union co-workers to join up and support the bargaining process. The Premier herself recently said, and I quote, "There is nothing more powerful than workers standing together. Let's prove her right."
Thanks, Lis. And as she was talking about, we have got to the log of claims process. It's been out for a significant period of time. We'll be hoping to try and get members to try and have those in by kind of Tuesday next week. We'll do a reminder email on Tuesday, but that really is the last opportunity to develop the broader issues that will then move forward to a delegate conference on the 16th and 17th of May. And that conference will primarily be determining not only about the issues that matter for schools and education members, but also the strategy that it would take to win in terms of those processes. We saw last time around, we were able to get some significant wins we'd never been able to get to in the core EB, but there were significant groups such as AO2s and other groups we weren't able to make as much improvement as we would like. We did get some improvements around the allowances and things, but this is really the opportunity to think through what really matters to members in education and schools, and then put that through the log of claims. If you haven't had an opportunity to return that survey, get it in over the next couple of days, and that means those results can then be reported back to the delegate conference on 16-17 May. But as Sharon mentioned, one of the other key issues in terms of bargaining is the issue of wages. And what we found historically over the last decade or so is a combination of things. One is that in terms of public sector wages, we have consistently been getting about 2.5%, and that has been above inflation. In terms of that process, though, what we have seen is that during COVID, we had the wages freeze, which resulted in one of our pay increases of 2.5% being moved into this year. So in 2021, the financial year, we have seen, at the 21-22 year, we've seen 2.5% pay rises to give us a total of 5%. But the other thing that we've seen coming out of COVID is that there's been a significant increase in inflation. And in terms of that, what we saw yesterday was that the inflation rate now Australia-wide is at 5%, 5.1%. In Brisbane, it's at 6%. Because of the nature of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, they don't have a Queensland-wide figure. So you'll see material being put out by the union over the next few weeks and months, talking about inflation being at 6% in Brisbane. What we know out of that process, though, is that speaking to workers in regional Queensland, they face a unique set of circumstances in relation to particularly the impact of the mining industry and resources industry on local economies, and that's had a bigger impact in relation to cost of living for those groups. So we're keen to be able to talk to the government about not only the fact that workers in Brisbane are being faced with a 6% increase in CPI, but also that regional Queensland is being hit by higher increases, if that's what we tell us. But what that really means also in respect is the government is saying at the moment they want to give a wage increase this time around like they've given in previous negotiated outcomes of 2.5%. If we end up with a 2.5% increase in this bargain, that will mean that we are going backwards by 3.5% this year. For the last 10 years or so, we've been able to get increases above 2.5% per annum. Inflation's been less than 2.5%, so we have been increasing people's take-home pay as a collective. The challenge for us this year is really the question about whether or not we are going to be looking at going backwards by having a pay increase of 2.5% with inflation at 6% or higher, or whether we're going to be in a situation of trying to move that process. So I think overall we are seeing from members are telling us in terms of today's Zoom that there is still a significant challenge in relation to wages in regional Queensland, not just Brisbane. And what that also has meant is that, as you saw in that graph, there was a delay process. So we didn't get a pay rise in the 2020 financial year. In 21-22, we got a 5% pay rise. And that was the government attempting to, was originally looking at a pay freeze, it then became a pay deferral. So that's why you've already had a pay rise in March this year, was because of the second tail end of moving the pay rise you were due in 2020. You then got one pay rise in 2021, and then you got a second pay rise this financial year to take account of that deferral. The other outcome of that, though, was that the government wanted to freeze everybody's wages for 12 months. And they couldn't do that because there were a certain number of agreements, particularly doctors and a few other agreements that were finishing in 2020. So what they did to apply that freeze universally was they extended some 3-year agreements into 4-year agreements. And so they got 7.5%, 7.5% over 3 years became 10% over 4 years, but they say had that same dip that we had as well. The unexpected consequence of that, though, was in terms of a process, was that then has meant that previously we were bargaining in terms of the public sector over about 2 years. We had doctors early on, and then nurses and doctors, and then a year later we had teachers and ourselves. What's happened as a result of the wages freeze is that we now have, apart from the core, which is next year, which is not our strongest area, apart from the core, we have in a 6-month period, everybody from nurses to teachers to police to fire to transport and main roads, and then all education workers, both our schools members plus UWU schools members in September, and then also in health, all non-doctor nurses, all the other groups in health are also in the second half of the year at the same time as our schools members. And what we've been talking to other unions about has really been then about whether or not, in terms of a process, that gives us a unique opportunity to think through whether or not there is ability to challenge the 2.5%. So rather than being in a situation when we're bargaining, the question being about whether or not we can actually come together as a union movement to try and move the government as a collective. So previously, each union would go out, we would try and move the 2.5%. And one of the arguments the government would use is that we can't give you more than 2.5% because we've just done a deal with the nurses, we've just done a deal with the teachers or coppers for 2.5%. And so therefore, you must get what they got. So what we're talking to workers about at the moment, and we've been, as part of the local claims process, talking to members in schools and in health, and in a range of our other areas, is whether or not we should be campaigning and in a collective sense. What that would mean for us is we need to campaign a bit earlier. The nurses are already in bargaining. They've been offered a 2.5%. They've said no. But come July, we have doctors, school teachers, fire, and transport and main roads, and a number of smaller agreements up for negotiation in July. Then in August, September, we then have our schools members, the UWUs, teacher aides, cleaners, but also our health members in terms of our allied health professionals, our admin and operational staff in hospitals, as well as the AMBOs. And what we've spoken to a number of other unions about is whether we're better off campaigning earlier in terms of the August and September groups, campaigning around wages in June and July, and then having a second round of campaigns to try and move that process. And what we've seen in terms of that process broadly has been strong support for that process, because we know historically the union hasn't been able to move the 2.5% over the last kind of 5 or 6 bargaining, last 2 or 3 bargaining rounds. But about a decade ago, we were able to put together a combined campaign, the wage balance campaign, that moved wages and moved wages policy significantly as a result of health workers, schools workers, police, and a range of other groups coming together and campaigning on that. And that's also what's happening in other states. So we've already seen that happen in New South Wales, in Western Australia, and in the Commonwealth, where state governments have been offering 2.5% as the standard wages policy for a number of years. And that's been not a great outcome, but it's been above inflation. But as we've seen inflation skyrocket as a result of COVID, we've seen combined unions in New South Wales, Victoria, and New South Wales and Western Australia, and to a lesser extent Victoria, undertaking what we're recommending in Queensland, which is combined campaigns to try and move those results. And so in terms of that process, we are getting strong support from members, not just in schools, but in health, to undertake that process. But what that really then thinks for us is really thinking about more than just a bargaining campaign this year, where we talk about wages and conditions, is really thinking about a 2-step process. And the first of those is in relation to a combined campaign and asking people to pledge to campaign about wages in June and July, rather than just in terms of the current process that we've had. And in terms of that, that's really what the pledge that we asked workers for yesterday was about. So members early in the local claims process said they were willing to consider it. That was overwhelmingly supported by members. And then yesterday, we went out, once the inflation figure came out, we went out and asked members in schools and health, would they pledge to campaign? And that pledge really was asking about, do we have enough members who are willing to be involved to make a difference in this campaign? Because in terms of that process, the only way we are going to move the government off their current wages policy is by getting enough pressure on them to do so, and doing that earlier than we otherwise would have. We'll still have school teachers and police and other people campaigning in June and July. What we'll be going to our members in schools and health about is saying, rather than campaigning just when your bargain is expired, are you willing to pledge to campaign? And we really need to know, do we have enough membership support in relation to that to make sure that we can campaign? And it's not just about asking workers to campaign, but also making sure that we've got enough workers and members who are willing not only to do something earlier, but to have their colleagues work together to try and do that. So it's great. And we've had over 1,000 members in the last 24 hours pledge to take action. And we'll be talking and trying to encourage more people to pledge to take that action over the next couple of weeks in the lead up to the education conference in mid-May, sorry, and then the health conference in late May. But then looking at going a step further in June, talking about combined wages activity in schools and hospitals before school holidays, and then probably ramping up to more significant action in late July and August, which will be still 6 weeks earlier than what we would have been talking about. So in terms of that, it's been a fantastic result so far, but in terms of that process, that's been a significant process moving forward. And what we really will be looking and asking you to do over the next period is get involved, because in terms of the ability to make a difference in this campaign, the only way we'll do that is if we actually in terms of that process, we'll have the two campaigns, the first of those in June, July, being about wages before we move into the conditions campaign. So the May conference will determine what we're talking about in August, September. But in terms of the wages process, that'll start commencing sooner than that. But whether we're talking about the conditions issue or whether we're talking about the wages issues, what we know from these campaigns is the only way we win those is having more people involved. And in terms of that, we're seeing great results and great levels of support because workers understand the issue. They know that the only way this government is going to move off a 2.5% wages policy is if they haven't got a choice. They are going to be concerned about the size of inflation, but inflation has gone to 6% in Brisbane. It's higher probably in regional Queensland. Queensland is higher than the rest of the country. We know that, and we're also likely to see increases in interest rates over the next. I'll be highly surprised if next week we don't see an increase in interest rate, which is going to put more pressure on working families to make ends meet. And so in terms of that process, we really need to make sure we can do everything that we can in terms of that process. And that's going to require action on the ground, whether it's signing petitions, whether it's attending meetings, whether it becomes rallies or other things. What we need to do is make sure that the government doesn't have an option other than to actually get to sit down and talk about in good faith what that really means. Unfortunately, the first round of those discussions happens literally in 7 minutes. There's a meeting at 4 o'clock that I have to attend to start those sector-wide negotiations about whether wages policy needs to move. So we'll be kind of bringing today's session to an end at 4 o'clock so we can go and start those other discussions. But those discussions are not going to win an improvement for workers around the negotiation table. We are going to be asking a big ask of government as your employer to actually make sure your wages don't go backwards against inflation, against the cost of living. You know the challenges you faced over the last 12 months as what prices have gone up as a result of COVID. The inflation figure reflects what's already happening. Anybody who buys the weekly or fortnightly grocery knows prices are going up and knows that petrol is going up and down all the time, but food is really staying high and has continued to stay high. If we're going to not go backwards over the next 12 months, we need the wage increase to be more than 2.5%. The government's not going to agree to that around the negotiating table unless they're forced to. The only way they'll be forced to is if we have enough workers in schools, in hospitals, in transport, in ambulance, fire, the rest. Everybody needs to come together as a collective and force that. So that is going to be a significant challenge for us. That is going to be meaning to run two campaigns or not one. But I think the option is do nothing. If we do nothing, we'll end up with 2.5% when we negotiate the education agreement in August, September. If we get involved and we're able to put pressure on the ground, we have one in the past. We have one on the basis that what we're talking about is the truth. Workers know prices are going up. Workers know they need a decent and fair pay rise this year to make sure they don't go backwards. So in terms of that, that's going to be working with our colleagues in the schools, irrespective of which union they're in. It means working with our colleagues in our union and other unions in hospitals, in transport and main roads, with our colleagues in police, in fire, in a range of those areas. And if we get enough workers on the ground taking action, I believe this government will have no alternative but to come to the table and offer us a fair pay rise. But at the end of the day, what that means is asking people like yourself to be involved. But the only way that other people will be involved is not just the people who are online today, and we've got a fantastic response today, is also to make sure that you can talk to your people, to your colleagues around in the tea rooms, across schools and across education. And that's why we're asking people to become workplace and campaign contacts. And that way we can ensure that we're able to have the strength on the ground to make a difference in terms of that process. So thanks everybody for participating today. I'm sorry I speak too fast on these Zooms, but we'll also be wanting to make sure that we deliver a wage increase in June, July, and then also make sure that when your bargain comes up later in the year, that we have the strength to win on the issues other than just wages, to make a real and substantial difference to the working conditions that you have, and make sure that you don't go backwards in terms this year in terms of entering potentially a period of long-term high inflation, which will be a real challenge for working families in terms of making ends meet. So thanks everybody for participating today. We'll try and use these Zooms moving forward as a way of getting information out in a quick and meaningful way. You'll continue to get emails and SMSs from you, but we'll also be sending out an email later today just asking if you've got feedback about how these Zooms should operate. We use them significantly in the public sector and in health, and they work really well, but we need your suggestions and information about what you think works, what doesn't work, because the key to winning this campaign will be about communication, because with good communication, the issue will be able to talk to workers and have enough people involved in this process to make sure we win. So thanks everybody for participating. Make sure that you stay involved. Please participate. If you haven't got the legal claim survey in, get it in now. And if you are able to become a workplace activist, that'd be fantastic, and we'll then be able to make sure that that over the next couple of months we win on wages and then we win in bargaining. Because unless you're involved, we'll just get what they offer. And I have to say, 2.5% will be going backwards against inflation, backwards against cost of living over the next 3 years. So thanks everybody for everything you've done so far. But we really need to make sure that we take advantage of the fact that we can work together with other unions over the next couple of months to have 2 campaigns this year and make sure that we leave no stone unturned to deliver everything we can for better outcomes for members in education this year and over the next couple of years through the next bargaining process. Thanks, everybody.